Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to another episode on the New Books Network. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Miranda Melcher, and I'm very pleased today to be speaking with Dr. Stephanie Rutherford about her book titled Villain, Vermin, Icon, Kin, Wolves and the Making of Canada, published by McGill Queen's University Press in 2022, which examines the figure of the wolf, the role of the wolf, which has had a bunch of different things, monster, hero, lots of different ways that this figure has been conceptualized in Canada. And this has varied pretty dramatically over time and with a lot of different impacts. So I'm very curious to have this discussion today, having had the pleasure myself of reading the book. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Could you please start us off by introducing yourself a little bit and tell us why you decided to write this book? What sort of conceptual contributions are you trying to make with it?
Sure. So I'm an associate professor in the School of the Environment at Trent University in Canada, and I'm an interdisciplinary environmental scholar. So I work sort of on the edges of geography, history, sometimes literary studies, cultural studies, that kind of thing, and then a little bit of wolf biology. I sort of dabble in that, though I'm a bit, not very well. And so I think and write about human-wildlife conflict and coexistence, and sort of in the area of environmental and multi-species justice. And so in addition to this book, I'm also author of a book called Governing the Wild, and I have a couple of edited volumes that explore nature, culture, animal research. And I came to this book kind of in a strange way, which was through the United States. I was researching my first book, and I went on an eco tour with a bunch of Americans in Yellowstone National Park, and it was focused on wolves. But wolves were, in fact, I would say, incidental to the work that I was doing. It could have been, bison or grizzly bears. For that book, I was really interested in how nature writ large was understood in cultural politics. But I was really surprised because the Americans on the tour started to laud Canada for saving wolves, unlike the US, where they had been persecuted to such a degree that they needed to be reintroduced from Canada. And it struck me as this really fascinating case of a misplaced kind of Canadian exceptionalism. Because my sense was that Canada had done very little to protect wolves, and it seemed more like an accident of geography. And wolves in Canada then and have continued to generate both light and heat. And the animals themselves seemed really, feelings about them were really polarized. They were either venerated or despised, and there seemed to be very little ambivalence on the question of wolves. And so this book emerged because I was trying to understand these strong emotions and often really violent reactions to wolves. And as I researched, I sort of began to see that the stories about wolves acted as a kind of like lesson in settler colonial politics about good and bad animals, about how nature should be made to kind of submit to human will, and also, I guess, who can occupy the land. And so I wanted to really think about how power is kind of written on the body of the wolf in Canada, and how that might be unwritten or rewritten differently.
And is that the sort of conceptual contribution you wanted to make with this?
Yeah, I think it really, for me, is a book. I sort of think about it as a social history of wolves, but it has two kinds of theoretical commitments to it. The first is that nations are multi-species assemblages, and so not all the actors are humans in the making of nations, or the remaking and reiteration of nations. And also, I wanted to think about the relationship between settler colonialism and animal life. And so specifically, I was really interested in the stories of settler colonialism, like how narrative and emotion can kind of cohere into renegotiated systems of power that kind of shape and reshape and reposition both human and animal bodies.
Okay, that's very helpful to keep in mind as we continue with our discussion. My next question maybe sounds like a kind of boring formatting one, but I promise I have a decent idea of what your answer is. And I think it's going to be a much more interesting answer, perhaps, than the question sounds. What I want to ask about is the organization of the book, the structure of it. Although it obviously is a book, it has pages, it has page numbers. Yeah, that's not what I mean. How did you decide kind of how to go about investigating these big questions and sort of conceptual ideas? You talk a lot about emotions. Which ones do you focus on? Why these? And why do you use them as structure?
Yeah, it wasn't originally my intention. I would say when I started writing the book, to back up a bit, the book is, each chapter is organized by a particular emotion. So fear, disgust, passion, curiosity, desire. I might miss one. Ambivalence and empathy. That's, each of the chapters is structured by those particular emotions. But when I began writing the book, it wasn't structured in that way. It was really going to be a chronological, and maybe, I think, maybe a slightly more boring engagement with this question. But when I got to chapter 2, I realized that the stories that were told about wolves had changed. And rather than this kind of paralyzing fear, which was where I started kind of in the 1870s and 1880s, looking at stories written about wolves, there seemed to be a shift, and there was almost a kind of disdain about wolves. The fear that people were expressing didn't seem quite so raw. And there was something else, like the wolf had kind of been transformed into a pest. And so it seemed to me that wolves were kind of this affective machine, right? That if power works through the senses, then different sorts of emotions were being called upon to sort of explain or understand or articulate our relationships with wolves through time. And so that's where the structure of the book came from. In some cases, I think it's a little more forced than others, if I'm going to be honest, but it was to really understand those emotions that can underpin power.
Mm-hmm. All right, this is definitely helpful to understand because we're now going to go into some of those emotions, obviously in less detail than the book does, but hopefully we can do justice to an overview of it. I wonder if we can start then with those stories you were mentioning, the settler colonial stories about wolves, specifically about wolves eating the settlers alive, which sounds pretty terrifying. But you talk about this being kind of terrifying in and of itself, but also speaking to a different fear, a bigger fear, a more amorphous fear. What's going on with these stories?
Yeah, they're really quite blood-soaked. I think it's interesting. It was interesting to me that there was sort of being expressed as kind of sheer panic, right? That you would be consumed by a wolf. And I think, as you say, there's, a very kind of literal understanding of those stories is sure, people were living in what they considered to be the wilderness, and were afraid by the howling of, were made afraid by the howling of wolves and so on, that they would be eaten. But I also think, that something else was at work too, and that people began to or write these stories, and what was being reflected was that it was seen that wolves were kind of haunting the edges of civilization, right? That Canada had not been fully settled at this point because there were these wild animals that might eat them, right? And it was kind of this improper sort of transgression that a human could become prey. And so the sort of, as the stories unfold, often what ends up happening is that the humans kill the wolf that's tormenting them. And so there's this kind of reassertion of human mastery and so on. But I think the fear comes from a kind of psychic uncertainty, right? That the land that white settlers had claimed for their own was actually alive with other sorts of creatures who might claim that land too, and could threaten their economic prosperity, could threaten their sort of understanding of what the right place of animals were in the sort of, great chain of being almost, and could reveal that the settler colonial project was not complete. So I think these stories kind of act as two ways. The first is that they reveal the fiction of complete conquest, and the second way is that in the stories where humans kind of slaughter those wolves, it's meant to reassert settler control over the land.
Okay, this blood-soaked nature of it, though, as you said, it comes through in these stories. It also comes through in some of the actions related to this. You talk about in the sort of, again, if we're in the sort of late 19th, early 20th century in Canada, given what you've been telling us about this fear, it unfortunately kind of is not that big a step to the idea that wolves need to be killed if you're a population experiencing this fear. Why, however, do wolves in this context need to be killed really violently?
Right. Yeah, I know. This is something that I was fascinated about. That there seemed to be this kind of excessive violence in the killing of wolves, almost, punitive in nature, right? That they wanted to punish them for even just existing. And I think it is really related to this kind of psychic destabilization that wolves presented settlers. And a friend of mine, Jeff Vance Martin, talks about this. He draws on Sherry Ortner's work to talk about this kind of surplus antagonism, that it's like this kind of pent up, like, reassertion of control over the landscape. And so, the sort of trespasses that wolves seem to present to settlers, both, literal, right, in terms of inhabiting the same landscapes, and also, I would say, metaphorical, actually couldn't be allowed to persist. Those two things couldn't exist at the same time, right? It couldn't be the lands that were being made into Canada also violently and also forcibly, and a land that could support a wolf at the same time. And so the kind of power of the wolf, I think, needed to be subdued, so this layer, at least one layer of colonial anxiety, could be assuaged. I would also say, there is a bit of and Alex McIntosh talks about this. There's a bit of a kind of spectacle of the scaffold drawing on Foucault, that you see in, he talks about this in relation to animal sports like dog fighting and bear baiting. But they hinge on the same sort of signs and systems of power, but work through anthropocentrism, right? So the wolf's body is punished for its transgressions in this immensely violent way.
Immensely violent is definitely the term for it, based on some of the examples you go into further detail on in the book, which to me made it all the more interesting to read that as sort of time continues, we're getting this idea that the fear is still there from the settler colonizers in Canada. But as you mentioned right at the beginning of our conversation, there's also this kind of overlay of disgust, of disdain. That's a really interesting transition to me. Can you help us understand like when and why this happens?
Yeah, it sort of starts to change in the early 1900s, 1920s, around there. I think it's in part because people encountered wolves less as settlement proceeded and agriculture and so on. They were kind of certainly pushed to the margins of their range. And they became more of a pest, right? Wolves would and continue to attack and kill livestock. And so they were reconceived as kind of a pest to the economic stakes of the nation, sort of reinvented as almost a trash animal, or like a form of pollution almost, like this kind of, and this view of animals as pests sort of signals their killability, right? But killability, I think, in new ways. And I would say the sort of disgust was framed through and kind of amplified by the economic costs that settlers were forced to endure as a result of wolves being wolves, right? As settlement proceeded in Canada, there was less wild spaces and also less wild animals for wolves to prey upon. And so, wolves began to look at these livestock as easy prey. They're not as attuned to what predation looks like as an elk, for instance, or as a deer. And so they were easy pickings, right? And so I think I think settlers began to sort of see the economic cost of wolves in a new way that made them have more disdain for wolves rather than fear.
very interesting to understand, especially given the kind of violence of the fear. The idea that it can kind of change at all is fascinating. And not just in sort of perceptions that one might come across, for example, in newspapers. You also talk about discussed changing government rhetoric and policy as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so it's kind of this interesting shift, right? So certainly the bounty had existed for a long time, where the government would pay individual citizens to kill wolves, and so what you had to do was present evidence of a wolf kill, often the ears, and you would be paid for your labor, and lots of people made a fair living at this kind of work. But around the time that wolves really begin to be seen as interfering with agriculture, ranching, those sorts of things, you have a much more systematized approach by the government, and so the bounties become much more widespread and much more systematized. But you also have the invention of a kind of professionalized government programs to kill wolves. And so these two wildlife management strategies kind of worked in tandem, and incentivized, and I would say reified, specific kinds of claims to the land for ranching, for farming, for hunting, and for settlement, which really worked to kind of secure the understanding of wolves as only ever kind of problematic vermin in need of elimination, rather than a more sort of generous or even more complicated understanding of them as predators. So they sort of, I would suggest, both the bounty and these more systematic efforts at wolf control that emerge around this time were about, in my view, purging the nation of something kind of unclean, an animal whose presence marked it for death, right? So yeah, it becomes kind of the practice of the government. And there's big debates at the time about whether the bounty's working, because the wolf populations continue to sort of be pretty robust in Canada, right? And there's lots of debate in the gray literature about, is this the right way to approach this? Perhaps we should follow the United States in their very systematic efforts and very successful efforts to annihilate wolves. But it really sort of changes the tone of who's responsible for managing this problematic population of animals.
Yeah, and again, the idea of vermin, right, coming back to the title, problematic population of animals is a really, that's a very different sort of take on the blood-soaked killers that we started off with. How does this then relate to the professionalization of wolf killing?
Well, I think, when an animal gets identified as vermin, the approach to killing it can often change, right? And so what we see is a lot of poisoning of wolves, which ended up being deeply problematic for other animals too, right? So they would poison wolves, and then other animals would consume those wolves, and you'd have like massive amounts of animal death as a result of this, government-controlled effort to control wolf populations. So that was in the the early part of the century, and there were certainly large debates about the use of strychnine and other poisoning agents to kill wolves. But you also, in closer to the present day, or even the present day now, you have wolf control programs in British Columbia, ostensibly to save the mountain caribou, who are critically endangered, that involve wolf culls. So, widespread blanket killing of wolves to maintain this other more valuable population of animals, considered to be more valuable population of animals. And so, I would say it's not inflected with the same sort of violence, perhaps, as those blood-soaked tales we talked about earlier. But there is a way in which it's almost like this inevitable end, or at least a goal of an inevitable end to this nuisance, this problem, which needs to be eliminated from the landscape.
All right, so we've got a whole bunch of fear, we've got disgust, we've got it happening in culture, we've got it happening in terms of government, we've got it happening in terms of now like literal jobs and kind of policies around how best to kill wolves. Given that, the idea of the wolf being refashioned in any way that isn't entirely negative is pretty stunning. So, can you help us understand how that happened through literature? It sounds like from your book is kind of one of the leading drivers of this.
Yeah, I would say it's sort of uh, early on literature and then sort of literature and biology at the same time. But Ernest Thompson Seton, who was actually a Canadian, though resided in the United States for most of his life, was sort of an early wolf lover and wrote these kind of fantastic tales about these singular individual wolves who were remarkable perhaps only because they were fading from the landscape, right? But these mavericks who, as a result of predator control programs, became so smart at evading those predator control programs that they were almost legendary, right? And Seton talks about, or invites us, I think, to see wolves as individuals through his what was called then the realistic animal story, though there was lots of people who thought there was almost no realism in those stories. And he had this interesting. So his insignia was the wolf paw. He would, next to his signature, there would always be a wolf paw. And so he sort of had this kind of almost obsessive relationship with wolves. It almost felt like he wanted to become one himself, or at least sort of absorb their power. But it was always inflected with this kind of obsessive and nostalgic, kind of devouring relationship almost with wolves. That I was interested to trace and sort of think a little bit about how it might transform relationships with wolves. I would say I don't think it did very much, in the sense that it was always the exceptional wolf that Seton talked about, rather than wolves, right, as a species. But sometime later, in the 1950s and then the 1960s, an important figure in Canadian literature was Farley Mowat. And he wrote, he was like our sort of preeminent nature writer. And one of his books was called Never Cry Wolf, which was made into a Disney movie, which I loved as a child in the 1980s. And he does a similar sort of thing. Like, he takes up Ernest Thompson Seton's threads and crafts this tale of wolves in the north of Canada. And he really sees them, describes them as individuals, right? He's, he famously tells this tale of trying to emulate wolves, where he drinks, these enormous quantities of tea, and then tries to go mark everything by peeing on every portion of the landscape, right? So he's trying to almost understand a wolf from the inside out, I guess. And so that book was hugely popular in Canada, and certainly the movie that emerged from it really began to change how people understood wolves as important to the ecosystem and as individuals themselves, right, who live in family units, much like humans do. I would say, though, Seton and Mowat sort of, when they think about animals as subjective beings in ways that I think unsettle kind of ideas about what animals can be and how they are different from humans, all of which I think is important. This question of whether animals can be subjects was probably not one that they articulated, but certainly I think was embedded in many of their stories. So this idea of agency, how can we come to know agency in animals, I think was embedded in their work. But both Seton and Farley Mowat saw wolves particularly as kind of anachronistic, right? So they both write in this register of kind of anticipatory elegy for the wolves that they write into existence. And so the chapter that I deal with Seton and with Mowat is called Passion. And I think what this shows is sort of that passion is a bit of a double-edged sword. It's not a straightforward emotion, right? It can be obsessive, it can be devouring, but it also may not be enough to actually see an animal for what it is, especially, I think, if these stories are framed through a kind of nostalgic obsession. So I don't know, I think I would say Farley Mowat's work, particularly in Canada, got a lot of people talking about the value of wolves on the landscape and seeing them as individuals, but I don't know that he actually allowed for wolves to be who they are on their own terms.
Hmm. Good thing then that that sort of thing, film, literature, those are not the only types of efforts being made to reimagine the wolf in this period. Can you tell us about what biologists and conservationists are doing?
So the chapter that deals with wolf conservation in Canada is entitled Curiosity. And I think it sort of aptly sums up the relationship that some key wolf biologists had to wolves. And so particularly there is, two biologists I talked about frequently, Theberge and Pimlott. And they were intensely curious about wolves and certainly wouldn't have engaged in the kind of work that they did, which was, to be in the field studying wolves over long periods of time and against very strong opposition. People did not want this wolf research to take place. And in fact, their research took place in and others took place in provincial and national parks. And many of the people who lived in and around those national parks thought that wolves should be exterminated, right? And that had been the job. I mean, we talked about professionalized wolf killing before. Part of the job of park rangers was to kill wolves for many decades, right? And so lots of the people who lived around those parks felt that should be continuing. And when wolf biologists got involved in the 1950s and 1960s, there was a moratorium on killing those wolves because they were studying them, right? And there was lots of displeasure around that. So these biologists engaged in this work against pretty strong opposition. And there's all these sorts of interesting news articles where, local people suggest that they're in fact breeding wolves in these provincial parks, right? There's this kind of massive like breeding program. And this is the real intent of the research and so on. Anyhow, so what I would say is that the curiosity of these wolf researchers allowed them, I think, to be open to the sort of unexpected, I guess, in wolf habits and behavior, and allowed them, I think, to see animals as more than populations, but as individuals with agency. So similar to Farley Mowat and Ernest Thompson Seton, but I think in fundamentally different ways. And they also invited the public to be curious about wolf life worlds. And I think in ways that I think were really quite productive. And one of the ones that I talk about is that Doug Pimlott realized at some point in his research that if he howled, wolves would answer. And would answer on their own terms. Sometimes they would not answer, but often they would answer because they were curious about who this interloper was on the landscape, right? And out of that discovery came the Algonquin Park wolf howl, where thousands of people will go and stand on the side of the road to listen to wolves howl. And so his work really influenced or shaped the conversation of this idea that wolves were important ecosystem members, but also that we might want to be open to different readings of the howl, not just as like this thing to be terrified of, but as a symbol of nature connection.
That is very interesting to understand and kind of put together the ideas coming from literature, film, and biologists and conservationists to trace sort of how the ideas about the wolf are changing over time. If we're moving through the book chronologically, as we're moving through time chronologically, chapter 6 looks at the coy wolf. Is that a wolf? Is this a deviation from our chronological progression, or is this in fact the logical next step?
So coy wolves are pretty interesting, and in fact a lot of wolf biologists would not like me using the term. They prefer eastern coyote. I like coy wolf because it sort of points to the unsettledness of this creature, like the hybridity of it. But coy wolves are fascinating because, wolves normally don't look at coyote as potential mates. They would normally, and I saw this when I was in Yellowstone, wolves will chase a coyote off a kill, like they will kill themselves, right? So they don't normally look at coyotes as potential mates, but the bounty and systematic wolf killing created this kind of evolutionary possibility for coy wolves to emerge, which are this sort of amalgam of wolf and coyote, and also some dog genes. So about 10% dog genes, 30% coyote, and let me do my math, 60% wolves. And what's interesting about them is that in the places that have been de-wolfed by predator control measures, and in cities all across Canada and the US, coy wolves have become the top predator, right? They're the ones that live in cities with us and, for instance, eat our pets. If they are pets that roam outside, they certainly will eat our garbage. And so they are kind of, living these parallel lives to us in ways that we're not always aware of, but certainly, their presence can be seen. And I was so interested in this coy wolf because there seemed to be this real moral panic about it, right? They are in cities. We are very likely to have interactions with them. We are not very likely to have interactions with wolves. And so, some of the work I did, I looked at a whole bunch of news articles on coy wolves. And, there was even the suggestion that it would be better to have wolves back rather than these unsettled mixture, coy wolves that are have all of the genes of a wolf that make it terrible, but also all of the genes of a coyote that make it terrible too. And so, these are super predators that are inhabiting our landscapes, and especially in our cities and our suburban areas. They're using green space to navigate the city, and they're clever, and they hunt in packs, and all of this sort of kind of moral panic language, right? It really struck me as remarkable. So in the book, I make this article that it's kind of their indeterminacy that provokes all of these strong feelings about them, like this sense that they too should be annihilated. But a friend who reviewed the book said, well, maybe it's just their ubiquity, right? They're everywhere. And maybe that's the problem, is that we have such close relationships to them, and they have this direct impact on our daily life. For instance, I had an outdoor cat that I suspect was eaten by a coy wolf in my neighborhood. He just didn't come home one night, and so, as you do, you put up the poster that says, "Have you seen my cat?" All of that kind of stuff. And a couple days later, there was another poster for a different cat, and another poster for a different cat. And so it seems like a coy wolf went through our neighborhood and just cleaned out all the cats, right? And so, because we are likely to, not likely, but may experience some loss associated with it, it could be that kind of the ubiquity of their presence and their close connection to our lives that generates all this anxiety. But people are deeply upset about the presence of these animals, especially in our urban and suburban landscapes. And so I was interested in kind of picking at that and understanding how that relates to the longer story of wolves in Canada.
So that, effectively takes us up to kind of where we're at now. But if we put all these pieces together, we then end up with sort of a mix of things around wolves in Canada today. Are there any other sort of these multiple and divergent perceptions that we currently have that we should discuss?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I talk about two key ones in the book. The first I've mentioned, which is the Algonquin Park wolf howl. And the second is the rise of the wolf dog as a luxury pet. So I'll start there. So the wolf dog industry is kind of fascinating. Wolf dogs are outlawed in many municipalities, but there are these advertisements for dogs that are quote unquote high content wolf dogs. And the idea behind them is that they're the product of a wolf being mated with a dog. Often that's not the case. Often you are buying a wolf dog that's been mated with wolf dog sort of generationally, or you could just be buying a husky or a Malamute that looks a lot like a wolf, but doesn't have any wolf blood in it at all. In any case, these dogs are expensive. Some of the high content wolf dogs can be $10,000 and upwards, and people seem to desire them because they want to own a wolf, right? They have this sort of connection to the idea of having this, that maybe says more about them, that they can own a wolf and that they respect this animal who's, in lots of ways a bit independent, or more independent perhaps than, a Labrador retriever or something like that. So there's this real burgeoning market, even if it is slightly underground, I would say, around owning wolf dogs. And, it was interesting to me. I think it's a complicated desire, and I suppose every desire is complicated. But so in some ways it's, a way to try to connect with another animal. But it always seemed to me as quite flawed because it really recenters human desire and certainly animal commodification and this breeding that comes along with that in this quest for connection. So it's about connection, but almost connection sort of expressed in the wrong way, or in a wrong way. Even because it always necessarily this desire becomes mangled through these kind of biopolitical practices of dog breeding and often abandonment. So the thing about wolf dogs is that they often become quite wolfy at around 2 years of age. And what that can mean is they start to see the family that they live with as a pack, and they begin to press for dominance. They try to figure out where their place is in that pack. And that can be pretty dangerous for kids, particularly. But they also do things, they need lots of room. Often they aren't kept in conditions where that room is available to them. There's stories of them chewing their way through the drywall of the garage in which they are kept to try to escape. And also there are instances where they have killed their owners. So often they're abandoned when they become very wolfy, right? So it's this kind of cycle of desire and all of that sort of thing that can often end in abandonment. They end up in wolf dog sanctuaries. But I think, this, we have complicated relationships with animals across the spectrum. And certainly, as Nicole Shukin would say, it's this way of kind of rendering animal life into capital, right? Into animal capital. So I talk a lot about that, about how it's complicated, that it's a searching for connection, but maybe in the wrong way. And the other thing that I talk about is the Algonquin wolf howl, which I mentioned earlier. And I think it's also complicated, but it's a little bit different. I mean, it's complicated in the fact that the animals that live, or the wolves that live in Algonquin Park are unfree, right? They are not, free animals to roam as they might wish, because when they leave the sort of larger area surrounding the park, they can be killed with, no problems. But the thing that I really like about the Algonquin wolf howl, and so as I mentioned, you go to Algonquin Park, you listen to a talk from park naturalists about wolves, and then you go and stand by the side of the road. Everybody is silent. 2,000 people silent, and the park ranger, the naturalist, howls, and you wait for the wolves to answer. For the last, I don't know, I think it was 6 or 7 years, wolves didn't answer. And so people would go and they would wait and they would be disappointed. The choice about whether or not to respond to humans, I think is the thing that actually matters to me. It's the thing that makes it, the Algonquin wolf howl, the most interesting, in the sense that almost unlike any other form of animal tourism, the Algonquin wolf howl didn't or couldn't promise interaction. And it operates on the understanding that wolves might answer based on kind of the coming together of a whole series of unpredictable variables, where they are in the park, how willing they are to respond, and all of those sorts of things. And they will respond in a language that's theirs that we don't fully understand. And even, wolf biologists don't fully understand. So I think there's a kind of decentering of the human there that I think it's important to pay attention to. The thing that I will note is that since I published the book, the Algonquin wolf howl has actually been canceled. And I feel sort of two ways about it. The ostensible reason is that it was not good for the animals themselves, right? That the animals, had been unsuccessful for so many years. The animals had moved further into the park, but that it was, it wasn't doing the work that it was intended to. But I feel a bit sad about it because of all of the, there's been lots of writing about the impact of standing in the dark on this road with all of these other people, and then hearing a wolf howl and then feeling what it does to your body, right? Your hair on the back of your neck rises, or on your arms, it's your heart starts to beat faster. Like, you do feel these things in an embodied way. And it seems like one of the most effective tools of kind of building nature connection and really building the idea or cementing for folks the idea that wolves were worth paying attention to. So I'm sorry, I'm sad to say that it's gone, but I do think it did excellent work.
Well, but there is this idea kind of from that sadness that wolves remain a part of sort of conceptions of Canada today, right? This isn't just a historical story that we're talking about. But given that effort at least maybe has some benefits, but doesn't quite tick all the boxes, what do you think are sort of notions of nationhood that the wolf can fit into for Canada today?
Yeah, so the thing that kind of underlies the entire book, I would say, is that this is a settler story, right? I'm a white settler. This is the sort of heritage that I inherited, or the stories that I inherited when I think about wolves. But there was always other stories that were present, both stories about nation and also about relationship to animal life. And so, Leanne Simpson, who is an Anishinaabe writer from the territories that I'm on, talks about nationhood as, in the Anishinaabe Indigenous perspective, as one that's rooted in both relationality and reciprocity. And so natural resources are not natural resources, right? They're relatives or gifts from the creator. And so notions of nationhood, then, if you understand the nation in this way, need to be rooted in reciprocity and in relationality. And so I spent a lot of time talking about this because it seemed to me that this reconfiguration of both understanding what the nation is and can be, and also how we understand the other non-human creatures who inhabit the places where we live, and if we also understand them as nations unto themselves, to which we need to engage in negotiations, it seems to open up this entirely new way of relating to both humans and non-humans that I think could be really productive. And so, the attempts to eliminate the wolf were really tied to violent articulations of settler colonial nationhood, right? That continue, I think, to do a lot of violence to people and to non-human animals, and also the land, right? And waters and so on. And so, moving away from that idea of nationhood to understanding wolves as members of their own nations, alongside others with their own kind of legal orders and systems and diplomatic relations. Even I'm working on an article about the wolf howl as a kind of form of diplomacy, which might be too far out there for almost everybody, but I'm enjoying it. Might offer us a new way forward. So I think it's about maybe decolonizing the nation and nature at the same time.
I was going to ask anyway about what you're working on now that this book is done, but I'm particularly intrigued now. What are you working on?
Okay, so I have kind of three bigger projects aside from the article I just mentioned. The one thing is that, after I finished the book, I thought, it was, well, maybe not enjoyable. It took me 10 years, which seems like a massive amount of time. But the wolves were sort of with me every day, and I felt a bit of an obligation to them. And then I published the book, and I was like, has anything I've written here going to actually change the fortunes of wolves in Canada at all? Or is it just going to be this book that does this sort of cultural theory work, and then, that's the end of it? And so I thought, I think I have to do something to continue this project that actually seeks to really shape perceptions of wolves in Canada. And so I have a new project that seeks to kind of bring these questions into the present, that works to understand perceptions of wolves across Canada and to map the places where wolves can thrive against where they might be accepted or not, right? Because it's often the case that people in cities love wolves, but they will never have to encounter one in their lives. So I want to understand that kind of on a national scale and invite divergent kind of rights holders and stakeholders together to engage in a dialogue about the value of and conflict with both wolves and coyotes. And part of that work is to use trail cameras to understand wolf and coyote life on its own terms, like what do their everyday lives look like, and pulling that together into a documentary. So that's one project. A second is I am very slowly working on a bit of a social history of coyotes in Canada and coy wolves. So that's like a part 2, maybe a sequel to this book that we're talking about. And I'm also co-editing a book on multi-species climate justice with Dr. Sylvia Cifuentes and Dr. Shayna Sadai. So it's busy. It's lots of exciting things, though.
Yeah, no, definitely lots going on. And while you are doing all of them, listeners can read the book we've been discussing, titled Villain, Vermin, Icon, Kin, Wolves and the Making of Canada, published by McGill Queen's University Press in 2022. Stephanie, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast to tell us about the book.
So lovely to meet you, Miranda, and thanks for having me.